Welcome to my review of Strider for the arcade. And yeah, I talk a lot about presentation, but I think this game has one of the best presentations of its time. It had a real cinematic feel to it with the music, and one of the impressive things about the game was that each scene really felt different. It didn't feel like there was a lot of recycled content. You know, as you moved through the stages, it was exciting. There was always like some set piece moments happening and something really exciting happening, you know. And it's probably hard to tell from this footage, but with the music and, of course, you know, considering the time when this came out, it was really impressive. Now, for me, I only experienced this game on the Genesis. I don't think I ever saw this in an arcade, so I played it on the Sega Genesis. And I didn't own the game, but I used to either rent it or there was a way that I played it somehow on the Genesis. I believe probably renting. But I did own it much later when I got it used, but the Genesis was pretty much dead by that point. It was probably the late 90s by the time I actually owned it. But, yeah, it's actually, the arcade version is very similar to the Genesis version. The Genesis version is a very, very close port. So, everything is pretty much intact. And this version is probably only slightly better, but I couldn't really tell much of a difference in gameplay. So, I will say that, as I mentioned, I think I already mentioned in this video, but it took me around 1 hour and 29 minutes to beat the arcade version, this version. I was expecting it to take quite a few hours because the Genesis version, you know, is tough with the limited continues. But then I realized that this game, you know, it had infinite continues, so that was a big help. And it's checkpoint to checkpoint. Now, I thought near the end of the game it might pull some bullshit where, you know, suddenly you get to the last boss and then you just run out of continues mysteriously. A lot of arcade games do that. I wouldn't say a lot of them, but there's enough of them that do it to where it's a nasty little trick. I actually made a text document listing games that have those little surprises at the end, so I don't waste my time working on them unless I'm really planning to really memorize the whole game, so I don't fuck up at the end and have to start the entire game over. But yeah, luckily Strider doesn't do that, so there's no surprises like that. And it has unlimited continues, so I mean, at least this ROM did, so this version that I played. But I have all the information in the tutorial about which version I played. And I break down all my strategies for each section. So if you're looking to beat this game, I'd recommend checking out that tutorial, which I will link in the description. And it should give you a good idea of how to approach everything. Now, I didn't find the game to be too challenging except for very few parts. There's a part near the end that's very hard until I figured it out. But aside from that, the game didn't give me a lot of trouble. I mean, like I said, I beat it pretty quickly. I was expecting it to be a lot harder, but it was really enjoyable to play through. And like the Genesis version, it pretty much has the same presentation because, like I said, the Genesis version is very close. So, you know, if you're already familiar with that version, then you already know what this is. But if you're looking for a version of Strider that you can beat of the original game, then the arcade version is a good choice because, you know, with unlimited continues, you can pretty much learn all the sections. And really, none of the checkpoints are really that difficult. So, yeah, it shouldn't take too long to learn. If you do get stuck on some of the harder parts, especially that part at the end, the tutorial should clarify a good strat to get through that. So it shouldn't be too bad with that. But the presentation is great. Now, there are recycled bosses and things like that were common for the era. And the gameplay is definitely not my favorite for these type of games because I never really liked the, you know, the floaty jumps where you flip, but it's cool how you can grab onto shit. But it is very easy to get stuck on parts of the environment. And, you know, the jumping is really wide and kind of awkward. But you do get used to it. But, you know, I never got a good feel for it to where it felt natural like, you know, a lot of other games. So I've always held that against the original game. You know, it was always something I didn't like. You see how when you jump, you really flip out in a wide arc. It was just never something I enjoyed. Now, I'm sure I could get better at the controls. And, you know, I got good enough to beat the game, but I still, you know, didn't really like the control with the jumping. And I still don't. I don't like how you can, like, latch on to shit all the time. When you're trying to jump across some platform, sometimes you'll automatically latch onto something that's above you, you know, and you won't land where you want to land. So there's just some shit like that makes it feel a little janky. But, yeah, of course you can overcome all that type of shit with enough practice, obviously. But it still doesn't make it good game design. But I understand what they were trying to do with the control to make the game more cinematic with all the, grabbing on the shit and flipping around. It does look cool, but I think it comes at the expense of tighter gameplay. But I do like the sword. At least you have a really wide range with your sword. And that's one of the things you can upgrade temporarily by picking up power-ups. And power-ups will sometimes give you a little bit extra health so you can take a few more hits. Normally you can only take 3 hits before you die. But like I said, checkpoints are very frequent. It's a surprisingly easy game for an arcade game, aside from the very end of the game. So if you're looking for an arcade game that you can beat, if you have trouble beating these kind of games, because most of these are much harder than NES games and console games at the time, on average. There's definitely exceptions with the NES games. There's some very hard NES games that are up there, but on average, arcade games tend to be a lot harder than even a lot of NES games. Especially from a checkpoint to checkpoint basis, like, the 20 seconds of an old arcade game can be so dense and difficult compared to what you would experience in, most NES games because of all the sprites and everything they can put on screen. But this is not one of those games that takes advantage of the arcade in that way. I mean, it uses the arcade visuals to have a really nice presentation, but it doesn't try to cram tons of shit to take all your money. It's definitely a game that would cost a lot of coins initially, but it ain't no fucking Gunsmoke or some shit, I mean, it's not going to take you over 20 hours to beat. I mean, it shouldn't anyway. It's a pretty simple game. They give you a lot of checkpoints. So it's definitely a fun game to play through if you're looking for an arcade game that's more approachable. I would say it's more of a... for arcade games, it's kind of like a beginner game, But for players in general, maybe more of an intermediate game for these type of old games. Now, I know it's different for modern players that have only played modern games. These games now are so much fucking easier than what games were back then, so it's really a matter of perspective and skill level. So this is the final part. This part gave me a lot of trouble to figure out, but you see, there is a strategy to it. I had to do things in a very specific order. So this was the only part that really gave me a lot of trouble, and that's why it took me around an hour and a half to beat the game. It was for this part. And I used save states on an emulator, of course, to practice sections, and I broke this up in about 2 or 3 segments to practice this final checkpoint. And then I was able to put it together and beat the game legit. But if you're not using save states to practice this final part, I could see how this would be a real money stealer in an arcade. Or if you're playing by, not using save states to practice. I don't know why you wouldn't use save states to practice, but I know some people like to put that on themselves. But to me, practice is never illegitimate. I mean, anyone who masters anything will practice things in sections. It's a common way to practice. I mean, you look at somebody who plays music, they practice specific parts of a song. But in gaming, it's considered like this fucking sin for some reason to do it just because we couldn't do it back then. We didn't have the technology to make save states in practice. Now it's like some fucking sin to do it, which I don't really understand that mentality. Now, I mean, I may have felt that way initially before I started getting into practicing with save states in maybe 2014. But, once I thought about it, I realized that, knowledge, practicing and getting knowledge is not like... it's not a bad thing. I mean, as long as you can put the game together legit, I don't see what the problem is of learning and getting the knowledge. But yeah, the ending is very cool. This you ride this snake boss, which was originally the first boss. Now you ride it out of the area, and you have to kill it once you get to these end platforms. So you're killing a lot of bosses in a row. And you see, if you do die, well, actually, if you die after defeating the bosses, they even give you a checkpoint at these snakes. Or at the snake, so you can just ride it again to the end of the game, pretty much. And once you get to the end, you have to take out this sorcerer, which I'm showing. I'm showing the full last checkpoint, so you can see how the game ends. But and the sorcerer is very easy. I actually saw a video on where to position myself, so I had an idea of how to exploit that guy. But as for the other checkpoint, I checked videos, but it didn't really help too much. For whatever reason. So I had to kind of come up with my own strategy for that. I may have used some of the information from the video, but It took me a while. Even checking videos took me a little while to figure that part out. But I think my tutorial will break it all down and make it pretty easy. It won't be too hard. But yeah, great presentation. Like I said, the control's kind of floaty. And that was the thing that I never liked about the game. I think if it had tighter control, I would have liked the game a lot more. But it's still kind of a classic game to me. But it's not, it's definitely not near the levels for me of like Ghouls and Ghosts, which was around this time, which I loved on Genesis and the arcade. It's not at that level for me, but it is memorable as one of the black box Genesis games like Mercs, Ghouls and Ghosts. There was a lot of them. And it's one of the memorable ones for me. But I'd give it a 7.5 out of 10. To me, it's a good game. It's not quite at the level of what I consider great, but it's just a good game and the classic game. The atmosphere is really the main highlight for me of the game. If you have any questions, let me know, and thanks for watching.